All right, final word, book club. Adam Collins with you. And as I said in the intro today, we are talking about Brick by Brick, a book that I'm holding up to the screen right now if you're watching on YouTube. The Australian Cricketers in England, 1964. And down the line, talking to me in Sydney is Max Bonnell, who is our author today. Welcome to The Final Word.
Thank you very much.
Max, we corresponded when you were in the final stages of finishing the book and the editing. And I guess we've had a bit of a theme on Book Club in the last 12 months or so of revisiting Ashes series from a long time ago. We spoke perhaps 6 months ago with Stephen Brinkley about 1926, which was really enjoyable. Last year, of course, Richie Benaud's Blue Suede Shoes won a bunch of awards talking about the 1961 Ashes, but one that hadn't been explored in this level of detail before is 1964. Maybe we should start there. What was the inspiration behind you going back to this particular year?
Oh, look, a whole combination of things. I think a lot of historians say that there's nothing quite as interesting as the day before yesterday. We know what's happening today. It's easy to explore things that happened a long time ago because they're unfamiliar. They're obviously unfamiliar. But the day before yesterday looks very similar, and you need to dig down a bit to find the ways in which it's really quite different. And, you know, when this series was going on in 1964, I was actually living in England, although I was 2 years old, so my recollections of it aren't terribly useful. But so that's part of it. It's my very early childhood and finding out what was going on around me before I could appreciate it. I guess there were two other things that drew me to it. One was it's generally regarded as one of the most boring Ashes series ever, and therefore it's been ignored. And I thought and still think that whilst in some ways it was a dull series, in other ways it's one of the great heist stories because the Australians turned up in England written off as the worst Australian side ever. There was one English journalist who argued that they were only the second worst side ever. He thought 1912 was worse. And yet they won a series against a team that man for man was really superior. So I thought it was worth looking at how that came about. And finally, I thought it was a really interesting inflection point in the history both of cricket and of England, because it's this real cusp between a game and a society holding on to tradition and seeing a need to modernise. And that's reflected at many points throughout the book, both in relation to the cricket, but also in relation to what was going on around the players while they were playing out the series.
And I think that's probably one of the strongest parts of the book is that you're able to weave in that social history. And I'd imagine that's, from your perspective, one of the most important things as a starting point. I mean, 1964 inexorably linked to the Beatles and the crossover moment at Australia House with the Australian team when they were visiting and the relationship the Beatles had, having, of course, toured Australia in 64, but having been at that particular building too not long before, and the way in which those two threads were running through the course of 1964. And it's not just that either, of course, that a Labor government about to be elected for the first time in a long time, the way in which the Prime Minister became the Prime Minister, being such a quirky state of affairs there. Maybe just dig into a little bit of that wider context before we go to the cricket.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think that the two things are really interrelated in a way that a lot of people who write about this kind of thing miss. A lot of writers will chuck in some of the social context as colourful background. But here, what I'm trying to explain is that in 1964, cricket players toured a country, not a series of cricket grounds and hotels, which is what happens today, right? You fly into the airport, a car comes and picks you up and whisks you off to a hotel. You go to a cricket ground, you practice, you play, then it's the next hotel and the next airport. But in 1964, they visited a country, and what was going on in the country mattered. So the second day after the Australian team arrived, the Australian High Commissioner took them off to meet the Prime Minister, Alec Douglas Hume. Now, the politics and the cricket are really tied up, partly because Douglas Hume remains the only English Prime Minister ever to play first-class cricket. He played a little bit for Oxford University and Middlesex and various amateur teams that back then were treated as first-class sides. So he had a real interest in the cricket. And the Australians did the normal mingle at 10 Downing Street. While they were doing that, and sorry, I should add, at that point, Ted Dexter, the England captain, had been pre-selected as the Conservative candidate for South East Cardiff by a process that is mysterious, but it was really just decided that a candidate with a high-profile name might succeed. And so you can't avoid the politics because an election was due to be called by October. And if Douglas Hume had decided to call it in July, England would have lost its captain because Dexter would have had to go off and campaign. So the cricket and politics aren't separate universes, they're one and the same. So while the Australians are mingling with Douglas Hume in 10 Downing Street, Sir Eric Harrison, the High Commissioner, has to leave early because he needs to go back to Australia House in the Strand and meet the Beatles because the Beatles are about to go on tour to Australia. So that brings the Beatles into the picture, and you can't really talk about England in 1964 without talking about the Beatles because they were the dominant cultural force in the country at the time. And that ties into the cricket too, because for the first time, the people who run the game have to come to grips with the fact that there's something else for young people to do. You know, they're competing in a leisure market and their competitors are the Beatles, and that's not going to be an easy fight to win. So cricket has to start positioning itself to make itself attractive to the generation that likes the Beatles, which is a challenge it had never faced before.
And this happens to be a particularly, well, at times wet series, although not a wet summer necessarily, but it feels as though the rain followed at unfortunate times through the course of the Ashes series that played out. But a long tour, a traditional tour where Australia are playing across the course of months, across every county team, of course, and MCC fixtures and other games that get popped into a calendar. The traditional Duke of Norfolk's, Duchess of Norfolk's fixture at Arundel, which sadly no longer exists, but for a long time was the opener thereof. And the way in which, through that lengthy process, as you say, that they were able to acclimatise and become part of the country. I like when you go through the stats at the end. The stats for the summer include a whole bunch of Australian players because they've played upwards of 20, 25 in some cases first-class fixtures.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, I think there was something like 31 games on the English leg of the tour. And of course, they then had to go off and play in India and Pakistan on the way home. But the driver for that was primarily economic because the Australians only got paid, or the Australian board only got paid as a proportion of gate money. So they needed to get people through the gate. So if you were playing Derbyshire in Derby, it's unimportant perhaps as a cricketing contest, but it really matters that you can draw in 8,000 or 9,000 people a day because that's paying for the tour. The Australians didn't get any share of the broadcasting revenue. The broadcasting revenue wasn't terribly exciting anyway. I found in the MCC archive at Lords the contract with the BBC for broadcasting the cricket, which was £200,000 for 3 years. So the Australians got nothing of the £66,000 that the MCC got for that. So they needed to draw crowds. So these county games were really the economic driver of the tour. So it mattered that the Australians played well in them and drew a crowd.
And the way they get there, I mean, they arrive so early in the summer and there's so much cricket before that first test match. Maybe we should move to talk about some of the individuals involved. The weaker Australia team, the retirements of Davison and Benno, highlighting that. Benno especially having been such a standard bearer and having visited England so many times. Now he's there on the beat as a journalist and covering the game as a broadcaster, and he went on to do that for decades, clearly. But at this point, it's Bob Simpson's team, who's yet to score a Test 100, and the side looks toothless with its bowling attack in the absence, well, with the exception of Garth McKenzie, who, of course, did such an admirable job as a teenager there in 1961. But taken as a whole, there's reason why when the Australians arrived, they looked derivative, and it looked like they would struggle against an England team that did have some all-time greats like, well, Ted Dexter, of course, who was leading them, Colin Cowdrey, another, and a young player called Jeff Boycott, who made his debut in the series too.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, Australia lost really three outstanding players at once. Benno played an extra year, but they lost Neil Harvey, who arguably one of the greatest of all Australian batsmen. They lost Alan Davidson, and we tend to forget how good Alan Davidson was. 186 Test wickets at an average of 20, and then Benno, who at the time was the highest wicket taker in the history of Australian cricket. So, and also a captain and batsman. So you've lost these three extraordinary players in one go, as well as much less spectacularly Slasher Mackay, who played a really important role in that side. And so they'd bounced from that to really being knocked around a bit by South Africa at home. The series was drawn 1-1 in 63-64, but Australia was pretty unimpressive. And the bowling was not good. They had Graham McKenzie just carrying the attack. Tom Vevers, who was an off-spinner who was terrific at blocking up an end, but didn't offer a great deal of attack. Neil Hawke, who really was not much more than medium pace. Alan Connolly, who was brand new to Test cricket. And so the question was how they were going to bowl anyone out. It didn't look great when they first turned up in England. It took Bob Simpson quite a while, I think, to find his feet as captain because he was new to it. When he was made captain of Australia, when Richie Benaud stood down, he'd never captained a side really at any level. He might have captained New South Wales once. He wasn't captain of his club team. So he was finding his way. And there were a lot of cricketers new to England. Graham Calling from Newcastle was picked as a new ball bowler who'd played 8 games for New South Wales. So it was a very raw, untried side. And it took them a long time to adjust to English conditions. Neil Hawke, who was picked as the swing bowler, couldn't swing the ball in the first 3 games and was wondering how he'd ever take a wicket. Alan Connolly destroyed his back in a meaningless 2-day game in Hobart on the way over and struggled with injury the whole tour. So an awful lot of work fell on McKenzie. who fortunately was the fittest man alive and massively strong and coped with it.
It seems remarkable that Mackenzie, just to go to him for a moment, doesn't get spoken of more for what he did as the attack leader for Australia. I mean, you could arguably say he was performing that role in 61, but certainly by 64 and then through until, I know it doesn't end well in 70-71, but when he gives it up ends up in a losing Ashes series, but an incredibly successful team player, 246-ish success wickets, in an era that was known for conservative play. And yeah, as you say, carrying this Australian team at a time when their bowling attack was modest. I mean, watching back footage of me being me, I've watched a lot of 1964 highlights when reading this book. And I mean, Hawke is approaching the crease off 7 paces. And I mean, to describe it as medium pace might even be generous, right? He's performing a role and doing it very, very well, but in context, of course. But, so much relied upon this one man as it did for so much of his career.
Yeah, look, he really carried Australia as a bowler between about 1960, well, from Davidson's retirement, from 63 through to that long tour of India and South Africa, where he was taken ill in India and never really came back from that in Test cricket. Of course, he played another 5 years of county cricket for Leicestershire after he dropped out of the Australian side. And if you look at the old clips on YouTube and so on, he's an unspectacular looking bowler. He's got quite a relaxed, short approach to the crease. And he doesn't look terribly quick. But all the English players I spoke to said, look, he didn't look quick, but the ball was hitting the bat hard. And he was much faster than people appreciate, and incredibly accurate, moved the ball around, and just kept coming. He was incredibly fit and had the capacity to bowl really long spells where he remained threatening.
Yeah, he really does bridge from Dave O'Lilly, doesn't he? That he's the missing link in all of that when you look at the chronology of Australian fast bowling. Just on the other side of the ledger, the way that England cricket is changing around this time as well. So these Australians arrive unheralded. That England team under Dexter, you mentioned the quirk of him being a parliamentary candidate during a home Ashes as captain. Imagine if, Pat was running for Parliament during the Ashes. This summer it would be a very different time and a very different thing. But even running for a constituency that he didn't ultimately win and wasn't necessarily expected to win in Dexter's case, which is another wrinkle in all of this. But the team that he had at his disposal, Fred Truman leading his attack, speaking of veterans, right at the tail end of his career, striving towards 300, but the politics of his inclusion, then his exclusion, then his readmission, then his 300th wicket, and what a huge personality he was around that England team, what a presence he was in that England team. But ultimately, across the course of 5 test matches, it was actually their bowling which proved to be not good enough to take 20 wickets often enough.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it was Truman, by this stage of his career, was an exceptionally good bowler. I remember Ian Redpath and Graham Mackenzie, Tom Vevers, all saying the same thing, which is that he was the kind of bowler who at any moment would bowl the ball that would get you out. Really good late out swingers and a really skillful bowler, but crucially not as fast as he had been. And that didn't matter to his effectiveness as a bowler, but it mattered to him. He wanted to be recognised as the quickest. And so he had these stages during the series where he persisted in trying to bounce people out to prove that he was still quick. Whereas if he just bowled his outswingers at off stump, he would have taken more wickets. And so there was a stage in the first test where Norm O'Neill hooked him for 4 fours in a row. And then crucially, at Leeds in the one test that was decided, he tried to bounce out Peter Burge with the second new ball and got smashed to all parts of the ground. So, and he was scapegoated for England's defeat and got dropped. Of course, he came back for the final test where he became the first bowler to take 300 test wickets. Part of the entertaining thing about looking at that was, at the time, everyone assumed that he had achieved something that would never be matched. It was unthinkable that anyone else would ever take 300 test wickets. I think we've now got 36 bowlers who've taken 300 test wickets. But it was regarded as this exceptional feat. And it was really interesting. The way England handled their team was they really had no idea what their best team was, what the best 11 was. And so they reshuffled after every game. And it created this incredible sense of impermanence and uncertainty. Truman, clearly their best bowler, easily their leading wicket taker, played only 4 of the tests. And they mucked around with people like Tom Cartwright and Flavel from Worcestershire, and then Caldwell from Worcestershire, who weren't really going to take test wickets, even though they were very effective at county level.
Yeah, Flavel being a through line from 61, where almost the identical conversation played with him there as it did in 64 when Australia came up against Worcestershire there. So I like that connection between the two series. I mean, just to go through the test matches in some brief detail, getting to the decisive one. So, yeah, a wet draw at Nottingham where ball dominates bat for the most part, with Mackenzie, the aforementioned, taking a fifer for Australia. A draw at Lords as well, with that what sounds, reading through it from your chapter and then watching some of it back, a masterful 100 from John Edrich. 120, the only time that England batted, but again, not able to force a result there despite England having done well with the ball in the first innings. And then we reach Leeds, where England 268, fifer for Neil Hawke. Australia at one stage 187 for 7, so still, in arrears by 80-odd runs. And then Ted Dexter takes the second new ball. And I mean, the way in which this gets written up over time as being the moment of the Ashes, that somehow from a position of strength by deciding to try and finish Australia off with the second newie, and then Peter Burge exploding his career-defining 160, and that somehow turns the Ashes. I mean, so much weight is given to that one decision, isn't it, by Ted Dexter?
Yeah, look, all the English cricket writers identified that as the critical moment in the series. Australia were, I think, 7 down, still well behind the England total. And Fred Titmus and the left armer Norman Gifford were bowling very tight. And there's all sorts of different views on this, because Dexter takes the new ball. Truman decides to bowl it halfway down the pitch. Peter Burge was a phenomenally powerful hooker, and he finished up getting 160. Australia led by 130 and took the game. And it was really interesting talking to some of the surviving players about what they thought of that moment. And the most interesting person on it really was Geoffrey Boycott. I asked him, was that a big moment? And he said, look, I was 23. It was my second game. I wasn't going to have an opinion on who should bowl and who shouldn't, but I know Headingley. And the thing with Headingley is it's easy to say, give the new ball to the fast bowler and they'll knock over the tail. But when the sun is out at Headingley, it's the best place in the world to bat. And I mean, I think he said, look, I'm not going to criticise Dexter, but I know Headingley. And so I think what he was saying was, look, it's not a bad decision, but you've got to bowl really well to make it pay off.
Mm.
So Dexter got let down a bit by Truman and Flavel with the new ball. Titmus had been bowling incredibly tightly as he did throughout the series. In that innings, he bowled 50 overs for 69 runs, which is ridiculous. And Gifford wasn't that much more expensive. He bowled 34 overs for 62 runs. But, between them, it took them 84 overs to get 6 wickets. So they weren't creating wicket-taking pressure. And so I think it was probably an entirely defensible decision. And, of course, the other element was no one expected Neil Hawke to hang around.
No.
Which he did. He got 37 and played really well. So it's one of those moments that goes down as a pivotal moment in the series, and it was. But I think probably the blame falls more on Truman for having this incredible psychological need to prove that he was still the fastest at the age of 34 or whatever he was then.
Yeah, Hawke and Wally Grout being the other who hung around with
and Wally Grout hadn't scored a run for years.
No.
And he had been a very good player, but he hadn't scored a 50 in 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, and like that an idea of mortality as well, that like some of these players just zeroing in on his third test. So Grout is important with the bat here, but he passes away a couple of years on from the 64 Ashes. He dies as a younger man with those various heart complications that he had through his life. And this third test is where Bob Cowper makes his test debut, who passed away recently. Ian Redpath hit the winning runs, who also passed away recently. It sort of reminded me that the time in which you've compiled the research for this book, there would be a number of people you've spoken to who have indeed passed or are quite elderly. I mean, that must have been rewarding for you in some respects, getting the chance to speak to a lot of people in pulling this together who perhaps are giving you their last reflection on such an important part of their lives.
Yeah, look, one doesn't want to sound morbid, but one thing I've learned is it's really important to talk to these people while they're still around.
Yeah.
So I spoke with Ian Redpath, who was very generous with his time, and he scored 58 not out in the second innings at Leeds, and spoke very vividly about being surrounded by close-in fieldsmen, and the struggle was actually being able to hit the ball between the close fieldsmen to get a run because there were so many of them. And he was terrific and very generous, but of course we've since lost him. Bob Cowper, by that time, had become quite reclusive. I don't know what his health was like at that point, but he was uncontactable. I couldn't reach Bill Lawry. Two of the tourists, Jack Potter and Bob Simpson, are still with us, but are not well, certainly not well enough to talk. And Tom Vivers was terrific. Graham Mackenzie was terrific. Alan Connolly gave me the only interview I've ever done that I can recount verbatim. He said to me, I stuffed my back up in a game in Hobart that I wasn't meant to be playing and some other bloke pulled out. That cost me my test place for the 5 games in England, and that's all I care to remember about it. Which I think was completely fair. And Graham Calling didn't want to be involved, which I respect. So I got to a few, and I have to say, it's not something that I'm particularly good at because I played 20 years of grade cricket, so I've been conditioned to believe that someone who's played a higher level of the game than you have deserves deference. So I don't push as hard as I might. I always feel as though I'm intruding a little. So I'm not the most searching interviewer, but I was certainly grateful for their time. And on the England side, I got to speak with Sir Geoffrey, who was remarkably generous with his time and very funny. I don't normally think of him as a funny man, but there's a very dry humour there. Bob Barber was tremendous, and Fred Rumsey was good too. So it was really useful getting that insight from them as to what the series was like.
Yeah, it didn't feel like it was either overkill or underbaked. It felt like it was just enough sprinkled in from quotes from those who were there from the reader's perspective anyway. And look, in some respects, I think 1964, and I feel this even more strongly now having read the book, is far too defined by what happened at Old Trafford. Now, I'm sure most of our listeners will know this is the Simpson 100 followed by the Barrington 256, and a draw that gets written up as the flattest track in the history of, and so on, and an emblem of everything that was wrong with cricket in the 1960s. But as you say a number of times in the book, and as Simpson said at the time, I think this is important, Simpson said when he arrived that their objective was to retain the Ashes, and he knew he was dealing with a side that wasn't as capable as earlier teams that had been to England. He focused methodically on their fielding and their fitness, which would be a through line with him as Australian coach later on. So it meant that when they arrived at Manchester 1-0 up and got the chance to bat first, of course, Simpson as the captain and the opener and Bill Lawry as the other opener were going to bat as long as possible. And, well, they went on to bat for nearly 256 overs. So it does stand out, but they weren't incentivised to try and win the game. They were incentivised to retain the Ashes. And I guess my point here is that they never shied away from that. They weren't trying to be magnanimous about setting games up. They were trying to leave with the urn.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, Boycott was really interesting on this. He said, look, when we played, it was all about winning the Ashes. And if you won 1-0, that was fine. You'd done your job. And Simpson turned up. I mean, Simpson is this terrifically polarising character, both on this tour and obviously throughout the rest of his involvement in Australian cricket. Because he was a fairly uncompromising guy, but he was also methodical. And really the difference between Australia and England in this series is Simpson's captaincy and Dexter's captaincy. Simpson knew what he was doing, had a plan, had a strategy for implementing the plan, and all of his players knew what their job was at any one time. And that was critically important because they could perform those roles. Whereas talking to Bob Barber, he was brought in for the fifth test match. John Edrich had scored 100 only a couple of games before it was dropped. And I asked Barber, well, were you brought in because England needed to win and you were the more attacking player than Edrich? And he said, well, you'd think that. But before the game, I asked one of the selectors how they wanted me to play, and they didn't answer. And then England got to a position in the test where they had an opportunity to push on and score quickly on the fourth day and set Australia a target on the fifth day. And Barber said, we never had a plan. We were never told how to play or what to do. And so England just drifted along on the fourth day, scoring very slowly. I think Fred Titmus batted 4 hours for 50 at a point where they should have been trying to set Australia a target. So the difference between the two sides ultimately was that Simpson got the absolute best out of his resources by having a plan that he followed, whereas Dexter was far too inclined to let things drift.
Yeah, and look, let's say, just to focus on Simpson, Australia bat for 256 overs and England bat for 293. I'm not trying to undermine how boring this must have been, but Simpson had never made a Test 100. As we know, turns it into a triple, 311. after a century from Laurie, and then the 256 from Ken Barrington in 624 balls. He always strikes me as a fascinating figure, Ken Barrington, having been there at the Oval, working on the ground staff, and then on to what he did for both Surrey and England, and then also dying very early in life as well. But as it relates to Simpson's approach before they got there, you go into detail about how the Australians at crucial times in the series didn't drop anything, they were relentless in the field. They did that fitness work before they left. It was reminiscent of, what would later become known as Kennedy's Commandos in a footy context before the Hawthorn's flag in 1971, which is naturally a reference point in my own sporting memory. But Simpson realised that if they were going to come to England and win with what they had to control the controllables, I suppose, and fielding is one where you can over-index, I guess, in your preparation.
Yeah, Richie Benaud was the only journalist who, before that test at Leeds, predicted that Australia would win. And the reason he predicted that Australia would win is he said, in the last test match, they didn't drop a catch. Their fielding is sharp, and that's what's going to make the difference. And that a lot of that's down to Simpson's influence, apart from being himself probably the best catcher of a cricket ball that this country's ever produced, give or take Mark Waugh. And so that made a colossal difference. People talk about how boring the Manchester test was, and it never became a contest because the pitch was too dead. But one thing that interested me was people were always comparing the Australians adversely to the West Indians who toured the year before. And the West Indians were said to be tremendous entertainers. But during that 1963 series, the West Indians scored at 42 runs every 100 balls. During the 64 series, Australia scores at just under 40 runs every 100 balls. So the difference is so marginal that if you watch them over the course of a series, you wouldn't notice if you look purely on scoring rates. It's just the West Indians did it smiling, whereas Simpson didn't believe in smiling on a cricket field. And in that, on the second day at Manchester, Australia scored, I think, 300 and something runs, 320 runs. The West Indians in 1963 hadn't once scored 300 runs in a day. So as a contest, it was uninspiring because the imbalance between bat and ball was wrong. But you couldn't really criticise the scoring rate.
And look, it's before. Well, look, it's not before limited overs cricket. We had the limited overs competition in England. I think it started the year before, didn't it? 63 was the first final, and 64. You go and explain in the chapter that touches on that scoring rates were so criminally slow in those early years of I was going to say white ball cricket. It certainly wasn't white ball cricket. It was played with red balls across 60 overs, but still that one day cricket. And a lot of Australians got their first taste of what is now known as List A cricket on that tour as well. So, I mean, this is a brand new thing. All they ever were conditioned to was multi-day cricket.
Yeah, well, that's right. And it's really interesting looking at those early days of the Gillette Cup. The first season they played was 63, and it was 65 overs a side, 13 overs a bowler. So if you just walked in off the street to look at a cricket match, you wouldn't really tell the difference between that and a standard county championship game where often the first innings didn't last for 65 overs. There's a game very early on in the 64 series where it's been reduced to 60 overs a side, and both teams bat at under 2 runs and over, and one wins by 2 wickets or something. It's like 119 plays, 8 for 120. So there wasn't much sense of one-day cricket needing more urgency. It just gave you a result on the day. That was really all that happened. And the difference is Bob Barber, who works out during these first two seasons of one-day cricket that you can get a huge advantage if you get off to a fast start. So he makes Warwickshire a very competitive side in one-day cricket, even though the first two competitions were won by Sussex under Ted Dexter. But the way they did it was by playing 5 medium paces and putting everyone on the boundary because there were no fielding circles.
You could, yeah. Yeah, which would be, this part of what over time changes the way we experience cricket. Now, of course, you mentioned scoring rates, what they are now. It's a different planet entirely.
Utterly.
We should touch on Truman and 300. That famous scene that he played forever with Johnson's commentary and Cowdery's catch and Neil Hawke going up to congratulate the man who's just dismissed him and so on at the Oval, and it's brilliant. They're brilliant pictures, and it's a really iconic moment of the days when Test cricket was on BBC and it was such a huge deal. And as you say, the mountain that no one ever thought anyone else could climb, and doing it in the final Test, having been recalled. I mean, yes, it ends up being a draw. It's not an especially inspiring game either, although it's noteworthy that Jeff Boycott gets 100, the first of many for him for England. But that Truman moment and what it meant it didn't quite end his Test career, but it nearly did. And it's brought upon by a spell where he gets the chance and runs through Australia's lower order. And again, along with probably the draw at Manchester, it's the next most identifiable moment of this series decades later.
Yeah. Well, I think it must have been the second or third day, and Australia was just building a colossal first innings lead. They'd knocked England over cheaply in England's first innings for about 180. And Australia was 6 for 343. And Ian Redpath said to me, it was the last over before lunch, and he saw Peter Parfitt, who was a left-handed batsman from Middlesex, who sometimes bowled very unthreatening off-spin, taking his jumper off. And he thought, this is great. Parfitt's going to bowl the last ball before lunch. And he said Truman came charging up from fine leg and just took the ball. He wasn't going to sit in the field and watch Parfitt bowl. And 2 balls later, he knocked over Redpath's off stump. So that brought Graham Mackenzie in to play out the last 4 balls before lunch. And he lasted 1 ball, nicked that to Colin Cowdery at slip, at which point they took lunch with Truman on a hat-trick and on 299 Test wickets. And Neil Hawke came in after lunch, and Truman got overexcited and sprayed the first one outside off stump. Hawke hung around for a bit, got to 14, and then nicked another one. And Colin Cowdery caught that one. Truman celebrated. Hawke, it's on YouTube. You can see it. It's quite funny. Nicks the ball, keeps walking straight up the pitch to shake hands with the bowler. And all the England fieldsmen come in. And Geoffrey Boycott remembers being the last man there because he'd been down at fine leg. But 12 years earlier, he'd been sitting in the crowd at Headingley watching Truman playing in his first Test series against India. And so he was delighted to be there when he got to 300. And it really seemed like something unrepeatable. I mean, at that time, as we know, the person who passed Truman eventually was Lance Gibbs. And at that time, Lance Gibbs had 94 Test wickets. So it was just incomprehensible that anyone would get that far.
And the cultural postscript, and the off-field bits that we touched on earlier, I mean, there is a general election. There is a change of government. The way in which England changes through the 1960s. Indeed, the difference between what England would have felt like for tourists in 1964, perhaps compared to 1968 or 1972, the guys who were on that trip and returned times later, the country would have been radically different when they got back, and the game would have felt a lot different too. We're just at the back of amateur professional, but beyond that too, the way limited overs cricket and the way more enterprising cricket became the norm in the latter part of the 60s, and how that kind of reflected where society was at. And this would be a series that in some respects would have a line drawn under it.
Yeah, I think it was. I think if you went back on the 1968 tour, you would have noticed change not only on the field, but also off it in the general country around you. I mean, England in 1964 was still a very heavily class-conscious society. It remains so today, but the erosion had started, and part of it was the emergence of figures like the Beatles, who had a colossal cultural influence, but came from very humble backgrounds. And so there's a kind of democratization of fame going on, a sense that anyone can come from anywhere and be the biggest thing in the country. And there's a moment I touch on in the book where Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon, to whom she was then married, turn up to the Beatles movie premiere in Leicester Square. And it's the Beatles who leave with a police escort, not the Queen's sister. So there's a kind of just the start of a modernization of society that even in 4 years down the track would have been noticeable. One person who didn't notice much difference 4 years later was Ian Redpath, who went to Ken Barrington's benefit dance in 1964 and met an air hostess who he then didn't see for 4 years until he turned up in 1968, after which he married her. So there was a level of consistency there, I guess.
Love it. And for the Australian team themselves, one of those great quirks that having, had a stopover in Sri Lanka en route to England, they are on the way back and go in for 3 tests in India and 1 in Pakistan. It's an absolute marathon, and including one belter of a test match, the second test in that 64 series in India, which is an absolute classic. But, a relatively exhausted touring party. The mode of travel would have contributed to that, and ultimately finishing a marathon tour back in Australia. And I suppose cricket's not a great sport for finish lines, but this huge event going away and retaining the Ashes, and it's immediately followed by another test series.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it was actually a very quiet 1964-65 series. I think only Pakistan visited and they only played the 1 test. But then, of course, Australia had to go to the West Indies, which was tough. But the travel is interesting because it was the first team to arrive in England by plane. This is kind of one of the hinge moments between the old way things were done and the new way. They sailed to Colombo, then Bombay. And then in Bombay, they caught a flight to London, which sounds very modern, except that it took them 16 hours to fly from Bombay to London with 4 different refueling stops. So it was modern but different. And must have been extremely exhausting. I mean, they took, I think, 7 months out of their lives to make that tour, and of course, not one of them was a professional. These people were leaving day jobs to go and do this. Really remarkably different to the way we do things now.
So having spent this time in the day before yesterday, I don't know how long you spent on the book. I'm tipping quite a long time based on the research in it. How do you feel at the end of this process? I mean, plonking yourself in the early 1960s and all the research required to get your head in that space. How does it feel now that the book's out there in the wild and people are rattling through it, but also from a personal perspective, leaving that moment in time and I guess returning back to 2025?
Oh, what you do is you move on to the next one. I'm happy with it. I think it's what I'm trying to do when I write something like this is tell people something they don't know already in a way that's entertaining. If you're simply repackaging things people already know, I don't see much point in that. And I found out things that were new to me, mostly by talking to the players, but also by analysing how that series played out in a way that hasn't really been done. I think books are like children. You do your best and then you send them out into the world and then you move on. So I'll be turning out something else soon enough.
I was going to say, well, given the success you enjoyed with Black Swan Summer, which we've got to get you on to talk about at some point anyway, that remarkable 47-48 West Australia Shield winning season at the first time of asking, which we've, of course, discussed on The Final Word in the past, but not actually talked to you about. I'm sure there'll be another and another. And it's a theme, isn't it? I mentioned at the start of the podcast that there are a lot of these books that are coming out, going back, revisiting Ashes series, all in a bit of a glut. The 54-55 one landed on my desk the other day, which I'm looking forward to tucking into it at some point as well. And I'm sure there'll be one about 53 before we know it as well, given that's another series that often is reflected upon from an England perspective, with the success they enjoyed, and so on. So there'll be plenty more to pick from. But it sounds like you've already got your eye on something to come next in your long range of books you're looking to put together.
Oh, look, I think I'm done with tour books. I've done two now. I did one on the first West Indies visit to Australia.
Yep.
And now this one. And I think I did the West Indies one to try and reimagine what a tour book could look like. And then I thought it would be interesting to look at what that would be like if you could talk to some of the people who were there. So having done that, I think that's probably as much as I can do in that format. And the last thing you want to do is repeat yourself. So I've got a book coming out later this year on, unfortunately, I'm drawn to fairly obscure subjects. So I've got a book coming out on the English leg spinner Charles Marriott.
Father Marriott.
Marriott.
One we love.
Turns out to be a remarkably interesting character. And a much better and more important cricketer than most people imagine. But other than that, quite a fascinating character. So that'll be coming out later this year.
Very pleased to hear it. Well, you said you want to tell people stuff they don't know. I've learnt an enormous amount about a series that often does get sort of washed over. 1964. The book, again, is called Brick by Brick, The Australian Cricketers in England in 1964. Max Bonnell, thank you so much for joining us on the Final Word Book Club today. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.